Hello there, I'm K-Ball, and welcome to Human Skills, where I interview tech industry leaders about all the non technical skills that go into success in the tech industry. Christopher Chin has followed a fascinating, if meandering, path, starting in music and audio engineering, getting deeply interested in data, moving into data visualization and analysis, and now teaching data professionals how to speak in public and handle presentations. In our conversation, we spend a lot of time discussing communication, how to craft a compelling story around your data, how to determine exactly the right context to share, and practices you can follow to improve your ability to speak in public. Those practical tactics are great, but for those with interest and time, check out the later parts of this interview as well, where we shift gears and talk about cultural differences in communication, mindsets, and how to live as an introvert in an extrovert's world. Please enjoy this interview with Christopher Chin. Chris, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Kevin.
I'm glad to have you here. Do you want to get us started maybe by sharing a little bit about your career journey and how you came to care about these things that I've been calling human skills?
Right. Yeah, and thanks so much again for the opportunity to be on your show. To get us started, I guess I'll backtrack all the way to the beginning of my career journey. And that was actually in music, specifically music composition. So I was involved with scoring music to short films, and the aspiration back then was to become a famous Hollywood film composer one day. And things didn't pan out that way, but I carried that creative spirit with me throughout the rest of my career. So after music, I became interested more in the physical principles behind acoustics in general, more of an engineering discipline. So I transitioned into acoustic engineering very smoothly from music. So kind of more a scientific application of what I was doing before. And as a part of that work, I was doing things like acoustic consulting, so designing architecture for buildings so that they would satisfy certain sound requirements. And along that journey, that's when I discovered data, which took up the majority of the rest of my career. I found over the course of my thesis research that I was really interested in data, in algorithms, how things worked at a statistical level, creating analyses, creating the stories behind those analyses. So my thesis was centered around analyzing these audio recordings of endangered whales. And my job was to pick out in those recordings, is there a whale call present or not? So it was part of a conservation effort. And as a part of that, I fell deep into the world of data and I haven't looked back. It's an amazing place with such limitless possibility. And so that was the draw. And I eventually got positions in data journalism, data visualization, business intelligence later on in my career, all centered around analyzing data and telling stories about it. But over the course of that time, and what brings me to the current phase of my journey right now, today, is I realized that there's such an abundance of training resources out there for technical skills. If you want to learn a new programming language, you can go to YouTube and you'll find tens of thousands, I'm sure, available options for learning whatever programming language of choice that you want. But when it comes to soft skills, particularly the human skills that you talk about in the technical domain, that's where I feel like there's a big absence of resources that will help technical professionals get really good at that aspect of their craft. So I made it my mission currently as a public speaking coach for tech professionals to close that soft skills gap in the data industry.
Got it. Okay, cool. So we're in very similar spaces in this domain. Before we dive into some of those specifics, I'm actually kind of curious. I love the background in audio and thinking about music and music composition and how to design spaces for that. I'm curious if how you found that experience has colored your approach to science, and now technical communication.
I would say that the skill I learned in that creative part of my career, the tendency to try and think out of the box and not just about process, but how can we change process for the better, that influenced a lot of my data career. And the reason specifically that I actually got my first full-time, full-scale data job as a data visualization engineer, I was hired, the hiring manager told me, because I stood out due to my creative portfolio. So I had created a portfolio of all these data visualization projects I had put together, analyses I had done. I made it look really nice. I told the story in each of those projects, and they were impressed by my self-discipline and my ability to learn all of that on my own and then compile it into a form that was accessible for anyone to look at. So that idea that I wanted to bring creativity and use that within a technical space, that has definitely influenced how I approach work in the data field.
Yeah. Well, and you talked some about or what you said there about telling the story, I think is really key. And this is something that designers need to think about, data scientists need to think about, and engineers need to think about a lot. So how do you think about taking a technical problem or exploration and figuring out how to tell a story about that?
The thing that I hear a lot when people talk about data storytelling, which has become a big buzzword in the industry, is a lot of people feel reluctant to lean into that because it sounds the idea of data storytelling, the word storytelling within that evokes images of movies and fictional things and something that's not really relevant to the technical space. But I would argue that it's not actually the stories themselves that are applicable to our technical world, but it's the narrative structures within those stories that we can use within our communications and presentations. So, for example, any classic archetypal story will have the main character within a context at the beginning, the original world. And this is the classic hero's journey archetype. So they're in the original world. Things are okay. Then something changes the status quo. And suddenly they realize they need to go somewhere else to learn something new. And over the course of different trials and tribulations, a lot of tension and resolution, they eventually become a stronger character at the end that has learned through their journey and now can implement it and teach others about it. So that device of context, then some kind of climax and the conclusion, that 3-step arc, that is the centerpiece of any kind of presentation or communication. So if you're giving a business presentation about some data you analyzed, first talk about the context. What's the original world that we're in? How are things in the business right now or in the past? Then build up to your major insight that you want to convey. This is the problem that we need to resolve. And then at the conclusion, you'd say what action we can take to resolve that problem. So if you incorporate that systematic sequence of tension and resolution and how we can learn from our past experiences, that is the key to engaging someone in your communications.
I love that clear description there. That's super helpful. I'm going to dig into each little piece of that. So when you think about, all right, let's take that structure: context, problem, proposed resolution. Starting with context, how do you think about what is going to be the appropriate context to share and how to present that in a way that it sets up your story to achieve what you're trying to achieve?
I think at this point is where it's important to actually construct your presentation out of order. And what I found working with several clients in their presentations is that it's important to not go beginning to end, because often the hardest thing to come up with is a good introduction. What is my opening line going to be? How am I going to start this thing when I don't know what's coming after? So what I found works really well is to first figure out what the main point of your presentation is. So first figure out the middle, the climax. That's the main point you want everybody to remember once they leave the room. After that, figure out the conclusion, which should be obvious based on your work. What can we do to resolve that problem? So now you have the last half. Then you can go back to the context and fill in only the necessary detail that the audience would need to know in order to understand what follows.
I like that. Okay. So how do you figure that out then?
Yeah, so that comes down to concise communication. And this is where there's this famous quote out there that goes something like, the authoring of a book is the easy part. It's the editing that takes up the 4/5 of the rest of the work. So editing is where the real work begins, where you have to figure out what stays and what you can let go of. And the hardest thing for us as authors of our own work is to take things away because we've invested so much time and resources into creating it. But that's the most important part of the process. So what I recommend for especially that beginning part, figuring out what context is relevant, is to think every fact, can it go or can it stay? And to think of it not as this from the standpoint of more information is more informative for the audience, but to think of it as more information is actually less informative for the audience. So every new fact that you add actually takes away from people understanding your insight. It adds more noise and hides the signal. So I recommend that for every fact that you're thinking of adding, every piece of context you're thinking of adding to the story, think about whether it really belongs. If you take it out, can it still stand strong on its own? If you add it in, will it actually benefit anything? So to do that for every piece of information you want to add.
Got it. So you have your main point that you want to make. You're assessing each fact. Are there like particular questions you're asking yourself for each fact? Like, okay, I'm just spitballing here, but like, if this fact is missing, will the main point still make sense? Or like, what are the questions that you ask breaking down that, like, can this stay or can this go?
I think that the best way to approach that kind of questioning process is to think about, even more so than what information to include, what does the audience need to hear? So often what happens I see with clients who are developing their presentations is they think about what they need to say, but not what their audience needs to hear. So they're thinking about what information can I put on all these slides to inform my audience about something, but they're not really thinking about the other person on the other side and what information they want to know about. So the way to approach that questioning process well is to know your audience. So do the research to figure out who your audience is, what's their level of technical proficiency to start out with. That will inform what kind of context would be relevant for them to hear. And also think about what kind of information has your audience seen in the past. So when you present your new finding to them, is that something they'll expect, or will they be surprised and actually angry and frustrated with what you're presenting to them? And that will inform what context you give to them. If you do your research well for your audience, you'll understand what they've seen before. You might not even need to say certain things because they already know it. And the last is to really know what action they need to take once they leave the room. So using just enough context to help them understand what action that is and why it's applicable to them.
That makes sense. So can you give some examples with particular audiences, how you would approach thinking about those things?
I guess as one example, and this might be more of an analogy, but for dashboard design, which is something I did a lot of during my time in the industry, and dashboards are these kind of one-stop shops that have all these charts and graphics and numbers that an executive or someone can look at and say, okay, this is going well, this isn't going well, this is what we need to do. So how I approach dashboard design is the same way that I approach presentation design. And that is, think about who your audience is and what they need to know. So for a developer, at the same level as me in the team hierarchy, for example, they would need to know a lot more granular information, technical information about whatever data I'm analyzing. So maybe if, for example, I'm analyzing data that corresponds to information being transferred from place to place, a developer like me would want to see it at a granular level. So each job that's transferring data from place to place, let me see that line by line. But an executive looking at the same data doesn't need that granular level of detail. They need the 10,000-foot view that says, is the team doing well? What's one number I can see that informs me whether they're doing well or not? So it comes down to understanding what your audience is and their needs with respect to the information that you need to provide to them.
So what are they trying to do with it?
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about persuasion, because you've mentioned, what you want your audience to do going out of this, and shaping your context, shaping your narrative structure to help guide them to that. What does it take, if it is something that is going to be frustrating or off-putting? How do you navigate that conversation and think about, okay, they're not going to be happy about this. How do I persuade them this is the right approach?
What I usually recommend to be maximally persuasive is to focus on the structure of your presentation. And this calls upon the storytelling that we were talking about before. What really works in storytelling is it engages people because it speaks to something very deep within our human spirit that we're seeking in our day-to-day lives. Stories show patterns of transformational change. And what I mean by that is, there's an example I like to use from the Harry Potter series. So maybe not everybody is aware of it in this day and age, but I grew up with the Harry Potter series. And so in the second movie in Harry Potter, there's this scene at the very end where Harry, the protagonist of the series, who's a boy wizard, he goes down into the subterranean caverns of the school. And in this cavern, there's this monster, the basilisk, that he needs to confront. And this is an archetypal kind of setup. So the hero, the knight in shining armor, needs to slay the dragon in the caverns of this place. And during the fight with the basilisk, he gets injured. And the venom from the basilisk is poisonous, so he's going to die. But what happens is a phoenix comes in, another archetypal mythical element. It comes in and its tears heal his wound. So he survives, he kills the basilisk, and then he saves the day. He saves the people present in the Chamber of Secrets. And that example shows the pattern of transformational change that speaks to every person when they hear a story. So it's the story about someone who starts in one place, they struggle, they experience challenge, and then they grow from that experience and they become stronger and more resilient, more capable for the rest of their lives. So anytime that someone listens to a presentation, if you use that structure of transformational change, you can persuade someone to take on your insights and be motivated to take the actions that you're recommending to them. So for example, in a business presentation, let's say that you start in one place. Again, that structure of context, then climax and conclusion. You start in one place. You explain things are bad now in the business. You might be frustrated by hearing these numbers that I'm presenting to you. But this is the action we can take to resolve that pain point in the end. So what happens is if you agonize that pain point, that frustration, you say, this is really bad. We can't keep going on in this current state. And I can show you through that transformational change how we can change the business for the better. Then you can persuade them, okay, there's no other choice. We have to take this action. Otherwise, things will continue in this bad route that we've established from the beginning. So persuasion is really about creating enough of a structure that fixates on the pain and then shows its resolution.
Well, and you've highlighted something that I think is really important, which is going beyond a presentation, which is if something's not going right, papering over it is not the right approach. Saying, oh, this is fine, we're going to make a few adjustments, we'll get there, is not going to inspire the change that needs to happen. Instead, as you said, you agonize the problem. Take it head on. This thing is not what we wanted it to be. This thing is terrible. This thing is bad. What are we going to do about it?
Right. And it really is kind of like a marketing tactic. I was actually looking for a new mattress at one point recently, and I was thinking about how would someone market a mattress to me? If they had just said, you can buy this mattress, it costs $999 and you'll have great sleep. Maybe I would have bought it, maybe not. But how they marketed it to me was they said, so how are you sleeping nowadays? You're tossing and turning at night, I imagine. You're not having a good night's rest and you're waking up groggy the next morning. Then they said, so here's the mattress that we can offer you, costs $999, and you'll have substantially better sleep. You won't be tossing and turning anymore. So they went on that arc. They said, here's the problem. You don't want this problem anymore. Here's the resolution, and this is what we can do about it. So it really comes down to that structure, that narrative arc that will convince people to do what you're interested in doing.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about another, should we say, common communication challenge I've seen. I think we as technical folks often do quite a bit of data gathering and analysis. And we want to incorporate all of the different things. And we go through that and we do a bunch of logic and we come to a conclusion. And something I've seen engineers do a lot is they will try to lay out all of those pieces and assume that their audience is going to come to the same conclusion they did. Never explicitly state it.
Right.
And this can go wrong in a number of ways. They might come to no conclusion. They might come to a very different conclusion. I don't know if this is something you're seeing in your coaching at all, but how do you work with someone whose mind starts from, I need to see all the things, and then clearly once all the things are visible, the conclusion will come?
I do see this a lot. And I was talking to someone recently about this very problem. The person I was talking to is a scientific researcher, and he expressed to me, as scientific researchers, we want to lay everything out. We want to be as detailed as possible, as informative as possible. So this can often be a detriment. If you're giving a talk about your research, you will give every single detail to make sure you've covered every base and you haven't missed a thing. So there's no chance people will misinterpret what you're saying. So you're very careful about your wording. And what I say in response to that is if you include all of that detail, people will not have any idea what you're saying because they're missing, again, that signal within the noise. And I tell them, the unfortunate truth is that people care more about feelings than they care about facts. So you need to think about what emotional reaction you want to elicit from your audience and cater to that instead of just giving them fact, because stories are remembered, facts are not remembered. Only facts wrapped within the story are remembered. So, and often when I relay that idea that feelings are what people care about more than facts, that often gets a response of, oh, well, in scientific research, we need to be emotionless. We need to be objective, scientific, and rational. And what I say to that is, yes, in the process you use to derive your information and insights, you need to be absolutely objective, scientific, and rational in order to get correct answers. But when you present the results of those answers, that's when you need to speak to people, and people respond to those feelings. So if you just gave fact, 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 they're not going to remember that. But if you wrap them within a story, within a narrative arc, then people will remember it. So it comes down to figuring out what information is the most relevant to your audience. This, again, comes down to the idea of being concise. So not just giving everything that they need to know, but arranging it in such a way that it makes sense in a logical story-like fashion. And you only include the information that is relevant to the action you want to inspire from them at the end.
There's a piece that you said there, which you're highlighting, wanting them to remember. And I think this is another area that's worth digging into, which is people can't hold that many things in their mind at once. And when you're doing research, you may be looking at 100 things over the course of 6 months. But at any one time, you're probably holding a few of those things in your brain. So you're able to grapple with it. And then you gradually piece together the structures. If you come and you lay out all of the pieces, again, instead of over 6 months, now they're grappling with it over 6 minutes, it falls out.
Exactly.
So how do you think about, is there more than just the story function to how you structure your communication so that people will be able to remember?
A good example from the same scientific researcher was he was talking to a reporter, I believe, about his scientific research. And he mentioned it was something to do with agriculture. And he mentioned some specific technical detail about that agriculture to the reporter, and they just stopped listening. It was just too much detail for them to remember or even conceptualize. It was all this technical jargon, and they just tuned out. The conversation didn't go anywhere after that point. What he realized from that was that when speaking to especially non-technical audiences, it's important to know what they're expecting to hear and what they'll actually relate to. So for him, if he had just said something about architecture plain and simply, then perhaps they would have listened more to the rest that he had to say. So it comes down to taking all of that information that you have and then thinking about what the audience will respond to most given their level of technical expertise.
Say you're in more of a conversation than a presentation. How would you suss out that level of technical expertise?
So if you're talking to fellow developers on your team, then you're pretty well aware of their level of technical proficiency. If you're talking to an executive, and perhaps you're not able to ask them directly or indirectly what's their level of technical proficiency, you can assume to not use a lot of technical jargon, assume that they're non-technical. And I came across this technique, it's called the Feynman technique, where Feynman was this famous physicist, and he recommended that the way you explain anything to anyone is you explain it as if you were talking to a child. And that's not in a way that's demeaning in any way, that you have to dumb things down, quote unquote, but it's actually giving them the most respect by understanding what they can understand. And actually the key to really deeply understanding anything yourself is if you can explain it in simple, easy to understand building blocks. So his recommendation is take any topic that you want to discuss and break it down so that anyone, even a child, can understand it. And once you do that, it becomes suddenly so much more accessible and you can understand it even more yourself. So that's what I would recommend in any general conversation, is to assume that they don't have the technical proficiency you do and break it down simply. If they require more technical detail, then you can go into that later on.
So starting without the detail.
Right.
And then going into it on demand. Okay, so as you highlight, that can be hard, right? Like, how do I take this concept that is complex, maybe has a lot of nuance, and simplify it to be explainable? I think that Eli 5 is the thing, right? Explain it like I'm 5. Like, how do I do that? That turns out to be hard. So do you have tactics that you use to help do that simplification?
I often recommend to my clients in particular that if you have, for example, a full-length presentation, say 30 minutes long, to prepare multiple versions of it. So not just the 30-minute version, but maybe a 15-minute version and also a 1-minute pitch. That way, you can understand all of your material in different lengths. So, and this is useful not just in preparation, but in the actual delivery. Inevitably, when we give a presentation of any form, something will go wrong. Something will throw us off from our groove. Some tech will break, and you need to be prepared to improvise during the presentation. And being able to have those multiple versions in mind helps you synthesize your information more and more. So having that 1 minute pitch, for example, you know exactly what you need to say within 1 minute that will get your ideas across in the most efficient amount of time. So I typically recommend, if you have a complex topic, work on preparing different versions of explaining it of different lengths. And once you get down to that most concise version, that's when you can deliver that to any non-technical person.
Can you give an example? Maybe not the full length presentation, but like a 30-second version versus a 6-second version or what have you.
Yeah, I was working with a client, and he had created I guess for the purposes of this example, he gave a 30-minute talk about some different courses he had developed. And I was working on him to be more concise in its delivery. So I said, can you prepare a 10-minute version of this talk for me? And then when he had done that, then I said, so how did that process feel, taking away all those details? And he said, yeah, I felt very uncomfortable. Of course, he wanted to keep everything, but it helped him understand what the main points he needed to convey were. And I said, okay, we're going to do that one more time. I want you to do it in 1 minute. And when he did that, he realized what the main point of his talk actually was about. And before that, it was unclear to him. Before, he thought he was just giving information about all these courses he had developed. But the real main point that we figured out when he synthesized it to 1 minute was that he wanted to convince people to adopt his courses and to take them. And so you gain additional clarity once you synthesize it to that shorter form. You understand what's the most important thing that the people need to know and what unnecessary detail that you've included there before was.
And then do you take that insight and apply it back up to the progressively longer versions?
Exactly. Then we can build it back up. Now that we understand what the main point is, that can inform how we structure the rest.
Okay. So we've talked about one narrative arc, right? The classic hero's journey, problem, context, situation, struggles, resolution. There's 6 or 7 classic stories. Do you use any of the others in your technical communication?
I usually recommend, in the case that you present to executives, for example, to do a kind of inversion of that arc. So for executives, you need to give the most important information they need to know first, because you don't know how long they're going to actually stay in the meeting with you. So make sure that you talk about the headline first. So if you can imagine like a newspaper article, it usually has the headline, some information to support the headline, and then supporting detail for that supporting detail. So you can imagine that pyramid idea where you have the most important conclusion that you need to know, the big headline information, then supporting detail and supporting detail. In that way, you can make sure that the executive knows exactly what's in it for me, why do they need to be here, what do they care about, and then you can go into additional technical detail for the other people present who need to know about it. So that's a classic inversion that I recommend. It's sort of, instead of talking about the context, climax, conclusion that I mentioned before, instead frontline the conclusion and then go into those other elements later.
Okay. So in your example before, we had, what was it? Here's all this data about why the business isn't doing well. It climax, if this continues, we're going to crash and burn. Conclusion, we need to do this thing differently. Can you invert that for me?
So in that particular example, I'd say the first thing that you would say in that meeting would probably be along the lines of, we need to do XYZ action because our business is suffering in this way. So one summary statement of both the problem and then its solution. Then everybody understands what comes after. And there's this classic idea in presentation that you tell them what you're going to tell them, then you tell it to them, and then you tell them what you told them. So it's a repetition constantly. So at the beginning, if you frontline, here's the problem and the solution, everything else makes sense and falls into place afterwards.
Why does that work?
I believe that it works because repetition is so memorable for us. And a lot of great speakers, what they do is they repeat themselves a lot, but in new and innovative ways. So for example, I think a classic example is President Obama, who he uses repetition constantly, analogies and metaphors, and he repeats the same word multiple times over several iterations to really bring his point home. So he'll say, I can't think of an example off the top of my head, but he uses the same phrases often. So yes, we can do this, and yes, we can do this, or the people over here are experiencing this certain issue, and the people over here are expressing this certain issue, and this is how we can bring those people together. So it's an example of using similar phrases and repetitions. That's what sticks in people's minds. And for my background in music, that's something that I carry forward as well. The reason why music is so memorable is because it has repetition over time. And it's again that pattern of transformational change over time. You have a melody, you repeat the melody, you do some variations of it over time, and then at the end, you repeat the same original melody. And people love and listen to music and enjoy it because it has that repetition. If I were to, for example, ask anyone to recite the last page of a book that they read, they probably wouldn't be able to do that. But if I asked them to recite the lyrics of the last song they listened to, they could probably do that a lot more easily because of that repetition. So repetition is so powerful in helping people remember things.
It's interesting because I feel like that feels different as a speaker than it does as a listener.
Mm-hmm.
It's very uncomfortable to feel like I'm saying the same thing over and over and over again.
Right. And of course, there's caveats to that. So in one client I worked with, he actually repeated a lot of his words, but it wasn't in a structured way. So he would repeat himself because he was trying to think of what to say. So for example, he would say he was working on, I think it was some kind of assignment that I had given him where he was talking about his day. It was like a 1-minute recording. And he repeated the word that multiple times and the word school multiple times, something along those lines. And it came off as repetitive because I was hearing the same thing over and over. The key to repetition and making it work and be memorable is using it in a structured and purposeful way, not just because you can't think of things to say and you remember the last word that you said and then you say it again. So if you repeat your words in phrases that are structured, that's what works better for audiences to be memorable and not sound repetitive.
Yeah, you want to rhyme, not repeat.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it.
Like, trying to think of other examples of that, but okay. You mentioned an assignment you'd given. So if someone wants to get better at their communication, do you have practices you recommend to folks? How do they approach that?
I have one big recommendation for folks to improve their communication, and that would be to record yourself. I find that that's the best way for people to know how they come off to other people, how they present not only their body language, but also their delivery of the lines. And you're your worst self-critic. So you'll see every flaw that's present and you'll know what you want to work on afterwards. This is such an uncomfortable, it is so painful. It is such an uncomfortable exercise. People hate doing this, but it's actually one of the most important things. There's no way to know how you appear to someone else than to record yourself and deliver those lines. Actually, someone asked me at some point, they said, how do I know if I am making a mistake when I'm speaking if I don't know what those mistakes are? So basically their feeling was, how do I know if I'm doing something wrong if I don't know what the best practices are in the first place? And so what I recommend to them was to record yourself. When you record yourself and you watch it back, you're not present in the moment, so you can see it a lot more objectively. So you can see what are those places where I messed up. In the moment, it might have felt really good, but then when you rewatch it, you say, oh no, the pacing was a little bad at that point. This is where I could improve in the future. So recording yourself has so many benefits, and that's the main thing that I recommend to people to improve their communication.
Yeah. Okay. Anything else that you recommend to folks as they're walking down this journey? Because I totally agree. I recommend that all the time. It is the hardest thing you'll ever do. Watching yourself can be so painful.
Right.
But I feel like there's potentially things that are less painful that you could also do.
Mm-hmm. I would also recommend that any chance you get in your day-to-day work to volunteer for opportunities to speak. Any instance is going to be uncomfortable and will challenge you, but the key to improving is to stretch yourself. So an analogy I like to use is the snake will not grow bigger unless it sheds its old skin, and that's an uncomfortable process. So if you want to get good at communication, you have to practice that communication. So in your day-to-day work, if you have a meeting, for example, often when I talk to my clients, they say, yeah, I really feel hesitant about raising my thoughts within a meeting. I feel like people will criticize it. Other people have probably better ideas. What's the use of me saying anything? I'll just make a fool of myself. And I say, if you never try it, you'll never know how it feels to deliver that kind of communication. You won't build that confidence in yourself if you never practice it. And you won't earn the respect of others if you don't make your ideas heard. Nobody's going to read your mind and know what you're thinking. You have to voice that to them. And by practicing in meetings, every single time you build that confidence in yourself, you'll realize, oh, I can really do a good job. Of course, it's not going to be perfect at first. But the more iterations you do it, as with anything, the better you'll become. So any opportunity you have to speak in a meeting, you have an idea that comes into your head, volunteer it during the meeting. If there's a presentation opportunity, go for it. Try it out. It won't be perfect the first time, but the more iterations you do it, the better you'll become.
Totally. All right. Um, are there other things that you think about with regards to communication, technical communication, or non-technical communication that we haven't gone into yet?
I think that there's a big aspect of culture when it comes to communication as well. So a lot of the clients that I work with come from a similar background to me, actually, in that they were raised in, for me, it's an East Asian upbringing. And for many of my clients, it's also a collectivist culture that they were raised within versus the individualist cultures as a generalization that the workplaces that we generally work within in, say, the United States or Western countries. And there's a big clash of culture when it comes to that in that respect, because in collectivist cultures, such as the one that I was raised primarily within, the idea is that you focus more on harmonizing with the group rather than making your individual voice heard. So in individualist cultures, perhaps the idea is that the squeaky wheel gets the grease. The more you make your voice heard, the more people are going to pay attention to you. And your voice matters is the common mantra within our workplace culture. Everybody wants to know what you're thinking. And if you don't say it, no one's going to know it. But in more collectivist cultures, the idea is that you don't voice that as much. It actually disrupts that kind of unit when you make your voice overly heard. It's more of the idea of you understand your role within the social matrix and you remain within it. So there's a huge clash when people go from one culture to the next. They feel very uncomfortable with the meetings. And I hear often from my clients, they say, I really don't feel comfortable speaking my ideas and making my voice heard in these meetings because I feel it's disrespectful even. And that's a huge cultural clash that is very difficult to overcome. It's been very much ingrained within our minds that if we speak to a person in perhaps a higher level of in the hierarchy and within our workplace, that's disrespectful. What if we even challenge their ideas? That would be completely disrespectful. But in fact, that is encouraged within many of the workplaces that I've worked in, that more individualist mindset. You can tell someone in a higher position of power than you that you think there could be a better alternative to their ideas. And they'll accept that most of the time if you present professionally, of course. And so it's really a cultural clash. And that's one thing that I particularly noticed recently within the clients I've worked with is trying to overcome that feeling of disrespect and feeling more confident that your ideas aren't being interpreted aggressively, but more just assertively. You're just directly and concisely communicating your ideas without stepping over anyone's toes.
Mm-hmm. I think that culture clash is interesting to look at the other direction as well. If you're coming from an individualist culture, how should or should not you express yourself in a conversation in more of a collectivist setting?
That's an excellent question. And for me, working within the more individualist workplaces, I understand best how to work within those spaces. And I have not worked within those collectivist settings. So I wouldn't know how to apply kind of this mindset I developed within the individualist culture to those. But I think something interesting and another analogy I can bring to the table is introversion versus extroversion. Mm-hmm. So extroverted employees will voice their opinions and will not be afraid to speak their mind. But more introverted employees will be a lot more hesitant to do that. So it's a very similar kind of dynamic. And I was actually working in one place where I had an extroverted colleague. And whenever he found an inefficiency, something that he thought could be done better, he would voice that opinion. And he wouldn't back down if he was challenged. He made sure that his ideas were heard. Whereas myself, I was very hesitant to do the same thing. Myself being on the more introverted side of the spectrum. So I'm very hesitant to challenge ideas unless I understand them thoroughly, until I've done my homework to really say, okay, this is why they had the process in place in the first place. And once I understand it, then I'll challenge it if I have good research to back it up. And so it really comes down to workplaces being able to encourage both of those sides of the personality spectrum to
Mm-hmm.
work well together.
Mm-hmm. Now, you've mentioned a mindset shift that you had to make from a sort of more collectivist culture to an individualistic one. Are there mindset shifts that you recommend for someone who's more of an introvert coming into a culture that perhaps encourages extroversion the way that the American culture my
Right. It has been a real challenge for me, at least in my early years, to assimilate from my naturally more introverted method of communication to the extroversion that's encouraged within American workplaces. And the thing I would recommend is that it's again this idea of knowing your audience just in a different context. So people within these workplaces, often your managers and your bosses, they will expect you to voice your opinions, to act in that perhaps more extroverted way for them to understand how to best help you. And it's sort of the idea that there's the golden rule. We treat others how we would like to be treated, but the inversion of that is people will expect from you how they also present. So extroverted folks will like you to be extroverted towards them because they understand that kind of dynamic. And so a lot of folks in leadership positions tend to be not all the time, but tend to be more extroverted because they need to be in those positions where they're front facing and they communicate a lot. So they would expect from you that you voice your opinions and you adopt more of that extroverted approach. So it is difficult, but I think the recommendation I would give in this case is again to practice as often as you can, to be more comfortable with the idea of making your ideas heard. And that to me is the best way to kind of bring in the best of both worlds. As an introverted person, you think very deeply about the things that you're working on. And you can bring to the table ideas that perhaps other people haven't thought about. And it just comes down to taking that advantage of that side of the personality spectrum and bringing it forward in an extroverted way when you deliver it.
Do you have any ways that you prime yourself to go and do that? I know for me, I'm also a natural introvert, but I have learned to adopt an extroverted persona.
Mm-hmm.
I even name them differently, right? Like my
Okay.
introvert persona is Kevin, and my extrovert persona is K-Ball, and those
I
are
love
two
it.
different personas that I can step myself into very deliberately because it is so hard and it feels so unnatural. But it's also like in different settings, different people are looking for something
Mm-hmm.
else.
Yeah, I was talking to someone the other day about this too. They were also a very introverted person. They said to me, you probably wouldn't be able to tell that I'm introverted because I've learned how to mask it so well to assimilate into these extroverted workplace settings. And I said the same to them. You probably couldn't tell from me either that I'm more of an introverted person. And it's just that we all have learned ways to be more extroverted and mask ourselves in order to assimilate into these workplace cultures that encourage extroversion. And the way that I like to approach it mentally, a kind of mindset shift, is kind of three things. And one is that the people that are listening to you in your audience, if you're talking to your boss, if you're talking to anyone, they want you to succeed. They're not going to want you to fail in your communication whatsoever. And an example I like to give is in a presentation. If you're in a 30-minute meeting, no one wants you to give a horrible 30-minute presentation that wastes everyone's time. They want you to succeed. The only person that doubts your ability to succeed is yourself, because we're our own worst self-critics. Everybody else in the room wants you to do a good job, but it's only yourself and the voice in your head that's telling you you're going to mess up. So thinking about it from that standpoint, the person you're talking to always wants you to do a good job in your communication. And the second thing I usually like to think about is when you're communicating, you will inevitably make some kind of mistake. Say it's a formal presentation, maybe you forgot what you're going to say on a certain slide. And the approach I like to recommend is to just go with it gracefully. So if you do that, if you take every action purposefully, no one will probably ever notice that you made a mistake in the first place. Only you are the one who knows that. So if you don't stammer, stutter, and forget where you are in the presentation and make that apparent, you just go gracefully through it. Nobody will probably notice that you made a mistake. And the third thing I usually recommend is there are a lot of nerves that go into any kind of presentation. We're all a ball of nervous energy when we have to go up on stage in front of the camera, whatever it may be. And the recommendation I give in that case is to just reorient that energy in a more positive direction. And what I mean by that is that nervous energy is just the fight or flight response of our body, just psyching us up to go into a challenging experience. How people usually approach it is from the flight side of that, the negative side, where we're like, okay, we can't be on this stage. We want to be anywhere but this stage or in front of this camera. And the whole time we're delivering the presentation, we want to be somewhere else. That's not a good way to approach it because you have to be there. And so if you instead approach it from the standpoint of fight, you're going to confront this. You're going to do well and come away with a positive experience. Then suddenly you're there with your feet planted on the stage or in front of the camera, and you are psyching yourself up to do a good job because you're confronting the challenge instead of running away from it. So it's just about understanding that nervous energy is inevitable. I feel it every time I go to any presentation. It's just about channeling it in a more positive direction.
Totally agree. Totally agree. I love to tell people like those nerves are just your body telling you you care.
Exactly.
But that can be hard to remember in the moment.
Right.
Awesome. Well, we've kind of gone in another direction, but let's follow it. So, other things that you've learned about being an introvert living in an extrovert's world?
Mm-hmm. It's often the case that people will doubt that you care if you don't speak up. So I was in a meeting early on in my career. I was working with a more extroverted colleague. And this extroverted colleague would speak all the time during the meeting. He would every few minutes, he would say something. And I wouldn't say anything because I was just taking the time to process it. Being a more natural introvert, I was just taking time to listen, to really understand what the problem was and come up with my own ideas that maybe I would present in a later meeting or after the meeting. But he was a very fast processor. So he would always make his ideas heard. And the feedback that I got after that meeting was this extroverted colleague, he's like a firecracker. We love him. We want him to participate in all our meetings because he always has something to contribute. Whereas this other person, being myself, he's as quiet as a mouse. We don't know what he's thinking. We don't know if he actually cares about the project. And so this is a real struggle for a lot of introverted people, I found, is that if you want people to know that you care, you have to say something because a lot of the world is programmed for this extroversion. I was actually talking to someone else about this. They were saying that, yeah, they do great work in their company as a software engineer. And their boss tells them, I don't know if you care about this work because you don't say anything during the meetings. And again, it's this idea that if you don't say anything, people don't know what's on your mind. And their natural assumption is that you don't care enough to say something about it. So that's one particular pain point I found being an introvert in an extroverted world.
Yeah. So how do you deal with it?
And so how I dealt with it was that I started speaking up during meetings. And it made a huge difference. And of course, this is, again, the idea of going away from the natural state that I would prefer to be in, which is just to listen and to receive and then deliver when I thought about it. But what I learned through practice and just iterations of speaking up more during meetings is that it's very constructive for other people to have that conversation in real time. That's what they expect. And the respect that I earned after speaking up a lot more increased. So if before speaking up during meetings, no one knew what was on my mind. No one knew all these ideas that I was thinking about. But after I started speaking up, suddenly people wanted me to participate in more meetings because I had some interesting things to offer. And people started to respect what I brought to the table from my unique standpoint. So again, it's this idea that if you don't speak your mind, no one will know what's going on and they will naturally assume the worst. So for me, the coping mechanism was just to speak up more during meetings and just to practice that and really refine it. And of course, as I mentioned before, it wasn't perfect at the beginning. I was very hesitant. I was very anxious about saying anything. I could only get a few words out at a time, but over time, I got better and better at it. And towards the end, it became a lot more effortless for me.
All right, that's it for this Human Skills interview. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking this video and subscribing to this channel. You can also subscribe to the Human Skills newsletter, which there's a link to right down below to get notified of interviews like this as they come out. Take care, y'all. This is K-Ball signing out.